The night my mother handed me $20 and said, "You're not our problem anymore," I didn't cry. I just stood there in the driveway holding a suitcase. Someone had packed without telling me, watching the porch light click off like I'd already stopped existing. I was 17 years old, 2 weeks from my 18th birthday, and I had nowhere to go. For 8 months, I slept in my car. I showered at a gym that cost $10 a month. I ate bread that bakeries threw away at closing time. My family never called. Not once. 10 years later, I built something from nothing. A company, a life, a future they couldn't touch. Then a lawyer showed up at my office with a lawsuit. My parents were suing me for $500,000. They called it filial support. I called it the biggest mistake they ever made. Because when I walked into that courtroom, my father's face went white. Sitting next to my lawyer was someone they had told me was dead for over a decade. Have you ever watched the people who destroyed you realize they didn't finish the job? My name is Brianna Blake. I'm 35 years old, and I own a financial consulting firm called North Star Advisory Group. I built it from nothing, no inheritance, no connections, no safety net. Just stubbornness and the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what it feels like to have no one. But before any of that, I was a 17-year-old girl standing in a driveway with a suitcase I didn't pack. I remember the weight of it in my hand. Someone had folded my clothes neatly, tucked my toothbrush into a plastic bag, even included the worn copy of Jane Eyre I kept on my nightstand. Every detail was deliberate. This wasn't a mother throwing her daughter out in a fit of rage. This was a termination that had been scheduled, prepared, and executed with the precision of a business transaction. My father stood behind my mother with his arms crossed, watching the scene like a supervisor, ensuring a procedure was followed correctly. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. This decision was final, and my feelings about it were irrelevant. The date was March 3rd, exactly 2 weeks before my 18th birthday. I wouldn't understand why that timing mattered until years later. Growing up in the Blake household, I learned early that love was conditional and distributed unevenly. My younger brother Ryan was the sun around which our family orbited. He got allowances for doing nothing. He got a car at 16 for grades that would have earned me a lecture. He got praise for simply existing. I got responsibilities. From the time I was 10, I cooked dinner 3 nights a week. I cleaned bathrooms every Saturday. I babysat Ryan so my parents could attend events they never invited me to. When college brochures started arriving, I was told to apply only to schools that offered full scholarships because there was no money for my education. Meanwhile, my parents opened a savings account for Ryan's future that they discussed openly at dinner. I wasn't hated. Hatred requires emotional investment. I was simply useful, a resource to be managed, not a daughter to be cherished. That night, as I stood frozen in the driveway, the phone rang inside the house. Once, twice, 3 times before my mother stormed back in to answer it. Through the window, I watched her face twist with anger as she whispered harshly into the receiver. Then she slammed it down so hard I heard the crack from outside. When she returned, her expression had changed, colder, more certain. "Your grandmother is dead to this family," she said. "Don't ever contact her." Grandma Eleanor, the woman who slipped me $20 bills at Christmas and held me a little too long when she hugged me goodbye, like she knew something I didn't. What had she done? What did she know about this night that made my mother's voice shake with fury? I wanted to ask, but my mother had already turned away and the porch light clicked off behind her. I drove until my gas tank was nearly empty, then parked in a shopping center lot and cried until I couldn't breathe. That was the last time I cried about my family for a very long time. For 8 months, my car was my home. I showered at a gym that charged $10 a month. I ate bread that bakeries discarded at closing time. I lost 15 pounds and developed a cough that rattled in my chest through the winter. Some nights the cold was so brutal, I wore every piece of clothing I owned just to stop shivering. I never called home, not once. Not because I was proud, but because I finally understood the truth to my family. I had only ever been worth what I could provide. And I refused to go back and prove them right. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my parents had been planning that night for months. The timing wasn't random, the packed suitcase wasn't spontaneous. And somewhere across town, while I slept in my freezing car, documents were being filed with my forged signature. Draining $50,000 my grandfather had left specifically for me. I had already been robbed. I just didn't know it yet. The robbery I didn't know about would take years to reveal itself. But first I had to survive. That winter nearly killed me. I'm not being dramatic. Sleeping in a car when temperatures drop below freezing does something to your body that doesn't fully heal. The cough I developed in those months stayed with me for 2 years. Some nights I woke up shaking so violently that I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood. But I refused to give up. Every morning I told myself the same thing: today, you find a way forward. And eventually I did. By spring, I had scraped together enough money from odd jobs to rent a room in a house with 4 other people. It wasn't much: a mattress on the floor, a shared bathroom, a hot plate I wasn't supposed to use, but it had walls and heat and a door I could lock. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously. Morning shifts at a coffee shop, afternoon, cleaning at a medical office, and weekend cashier work at a grocery store. I was exhausted all the time, but I was alive and I was building something. In whatever spare hours I could find, I taught myself. The public library became my university. I read every book on finance, investing, and business I could get my hands on. I took free online courses late at night when my roommates were asleep. I studied like my life depended on it because, in a very real way, it did. I had no family, no safety net, no one to catch me if I fell. Knowledge was the only thing no one could take from me. At 22, I talked my way into an unpaid internship at a small investment firm. The owner was a man named Marcus Webb, 60 years old, sharp as a knife, and completely unimpressed by credentials. He cared about one thing: could you think I could? He saw something in me that I was still learning to see in myself. He became my first real mentor, and over the next few years, he taught me everything about building a business that no book ever could. My career began to take shape. I was good at what I did. Clients trusted me. I saved money carefully, lived below my means, and started dreaming about opening my own firm someday. But something was wrong, and I couldn't figure out what. Every loan application I submitted came back denied. Every credit card I applied for was rejected. Every apartment that required a credit check told me the same thing: we're sorry, but we can't approve you. I had never borrowed money in my life. I had never missed a payment on anything because I had never had anything to make payments on. It made no sense. But landlords and banks don't care about explanations. They care about numbers on a screen. And apparently my numbers were terrible. At 23, I finally pulled my credit report. What I found made my hands shake. There were 3 credit card accounts in my name that I had never opened. The total debt was over $80,000. The accounts had been active for years, payments sometimes made, sometimes missed, creating a pattern of financial chaos that had destroyed my credit score completely. I tried to fight it. I called the credit bureaus to dispute the accounts, but they required verification documents sent to my permanent address. The only address on file was my parents' house. I sent letters anyway, certified mail return. Receipt requested. They vanished. When I called the credit card companies directly, they told me the accounts were in good standing and refused to discuss details with me because I couldn't answer security questions about purchases I had never made. I was trapped in a system designed to protect people from exactly what was happening to me, but the system itself was being used against me. Without money for a lawyer, without understanding how deep this conspiracy went, I made a painful decision. I would stop fighting the fraud and simply rebuild from zero. It would take years longer to establish credit the hard way, paying for everything in cash, slowly building a record of reliability. But I would do it on my own terms without depending on anyone who had proven they couldn't be trusted. Everything changed at 24. I attended a small business networking event, hoping to make connections for the consulting firm I was dreaming of starting. I was scanning the room for potential contacts when I saw her. Across the crowded space stood an elderly woman, looking older and more tired than I remembered, but unmistakable. It was my grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, the woman my mother had called dead to our family the night she threw me out. When our eyes met, Eleanor burst into tears. She crossed the room faster than I would have thought possible for a woman her age, and grabbed my hands like she was afraid I might disappear. We left the event immediately and found a quiet coffee shop where the truth finally poured out. They had lied to both of us. Eleanor told me that my parents had said I didn't want to see her, that I blamed her for not stopping them from kicking me out. She believed it for 2 years before she realized they had told me the same lies about her. She had been searching for me ever since hiring private investigators twice, but I moved frequently and avoided using my legal name whenever possible. Finding me had taken her 6 years. Then she told me about the money. My grandfather had left me $50,000 in a trust fund before he died. Eleanor was supposed to manage it as trustee until I turned 18, at which point I would have full control. But my parents had forged her signature on a resignation letter and faked a court order appointing my father as the new trustee. The money was drained from the account 3 days after I was kicked out. That was why they had chosen that specific date, 2 weeks before my 18th birthday. 2 weeks before I would have had legal standing to access the account myself and discover what they had done. I wanted to fight immediately. I wanted to hire lawyers and go to the police and burn their lives to the ground. But Eleanor had already tried. She explained the devastating legal reality. The statute of limitations for the forgery had expired years ago. The bank claimed the original trust documents had been lost. Without hard evidence of ongoing crimes, no prosecutor would touch a case this old. I consulted a lawyer of my own, a young attorney who owed Marcus a favor. She told me the same thing, but she added something else. The credit card fraud was different. That was ongoing. If I could prove I didn't open those accounts and prove who did, the statute of limitations would restart from the moment of discovery. Her advice was simple: build your case, document everything, and wait. That night, Eleanor and I made a pact. She would continue collecting evidence. Every email my mother sent, every suspicious bank statement. She even recorded voicemails, which was legal in Pennsylvania. I would build my resources, monitor my credit, and prepare for the day when my family made their next move. Because people like the Blakes always needed more. They would come for me eventually, and when they did, we would be ready. It took 11 years, but we were ready. I tracked my family from a distance during those years. My father's investments failed spectacularly. My mother developed chronic health problems. Ryan, now 32, had never held a job longer than 6 months and still lived at home. They were running out of money and out of options. Then my business phone rang. Ryan had finally hired someone competent enough to connect the financial consultant Eleanor kept visiting with his vanished sister. His voice was pure entitlement when he spoke. "Mom is sick," he said. "Really sick. We know you have money now. You need to come home. It's your responsibility as the oldest daughter. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done, just demands." I kept my voice neutral. "I'll think about it." Then I hung up and called Eleanor. "They found me," I said. "Get the files ready." 2 weeks later, a lawyer arrived at my office with an envelope. My family was suing me for filial support under Pennsylvania law. They wanted $500,000. I read the complaint carefully, then I smiled. By filing this lawsuit, my father had just given me something I had waited 11 years for. Legal grounds for discovery, subpoena power, the right to put every document and bank record under a microscope. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they had just walked into a trap. The trap was set. Now I had to let them walk deeper into it. My lawyer, Catherine Chen, had become a partner at one of the best firms in the city. She was the same young attorney who had advised me 11 years ago, and she had never forgotten that I was her first real case. When I called her with the lawsuit in my hand, she cleared her afternoon and listened to everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said 4 words that changed everything. "We finally have discovery." I could have ended it quickly. Eleanor had enough evidence in her files to make my parents withdraw their lawsuit in terror. One look at what we had collected and any reasonable person would have run. But I didn't want them to run. I wanted them to testify. I wanted them to tell their lies under oath on the record in a courtroom where they couldn't take anything back. They had controlled the narrative for 18 years. They had told everyone I was the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family. Now I was going to make them repeat those lies in front of a judge, and then I was going to prove that every single word was false. Catherine filed our response to the lawsuit and immediately began the discovery process. With subpoena power, her team pulled 18 years of records from banks, credit card companies, and court archives. The picture that emerged was devastating in its completeness. The bank records showed that my grandfather's trust fund had been drained 3 days after I was kicked out. The withdrawal authorization was signed by Brianna Blake, but the handwriting didn't match any of my known signatures. A forensic document examiner confirmed it was a forgery. The trustee resignation letter supposedly from Eleanor was typed, not handwritten on letterhead, that Eleanor's lawyer confirmed she had never used. It was another forgery, created to give my father control of money that was never supposed to be his. The credit card investigation was even more damning. 3 accounts had been opened using my social security number, all with billing statements sent to my parents' address. The purchase records painted a clear picture. Gaming systems, concert tickets, bar tabs, sports memorabilia. These were not my purchases. These were Ryan's lifestyle funded by debt attached to my name. And the most recent card had been opened just 14 months ago. My brother was still actively stealing my identity, still destroying my credit, still treating me as a resource to exploit even after 18 years. Finally, there was a paper trail showing how my father had moved the trust fund money through 3 different shell companies before it disappeared into a failed investment. He hadn't just stolen from me, he had laundered the money to hide what he had done. The court date arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. I wore a simple navy suit and no jewelry. I didn't need to perform. The evidence would speak for itself. My family arrived looking confident. My father wore his best suit, the one he saved for important meetings. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, already practicing her performance as the suffering parent abandoned by her cruel daughter. Ryan sat in the gallery looking bored, scrolling through his phone like this was an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. They had no idea what was coming. Their lawyer was cheap but aggressive, the kind of attorney who wins by being louder than everyone else. He stood before the judge and delivered his opening statement with practiced outrage. Brianna Blake abandoned her elderly parents in their hour of need, he said. She built a fortune while they suffered in poverty. Pennsylvania law is clear that children have an obligation to support indigent parents. We are asking for justice. We are asking this court to hold Brianna Blake accountable for abandoning the people who raised her. The judge nodded and turned to Catherine. Your response. Catherine stood slowly, almost leisurely, like she had all the time in the world. Your Honor, she said. Before we respond to these claims, we have a motion to file. She walked to the bench and placed a thick folder in front of the judge. My client did not abandon anyone. She was expelled from her home at 17 years old as part of a calculated conspiracy to steal her inheritance. We are filing a counter lawsuit for fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, and identity theft. We are also formally requesting that these documents be forwarded to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. The courtroom went dead silent. My father's confident expression flickered. My mother's tissue stopped moving. Even Ryan looked up from his phone. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Eleanor Whitmore walked in slowly. 78 years old, now moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had waited a very long time for this moment. In her arms was a weathered file box that she carried like it contained something precious. She walked past my family without looking at them, set the box on the witness table with a heavy thud, and took her seat. My father went pale. My mother's theatrical crying stopped mid-sob. They had thought Eleanor was neutralized, silenced, irrelevant. They had been wrong. When Eleanor took the witness stand, the courtroom was absolutely silent. She looked at my mother, her own daughter, with an expression of exhausted grief that 18 years of waiting had carved into her face. I raised you, she said. I gave you everything I could. And when you married Gerald, I watched you become someone I didn't recognize. I begged you not to kick Brianna out. You told me if I ever contacted her, you would make sure I never saw any of my grandchildren again. So I went quiet, but I didn't stop. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, my daughter and son-in-law stole from their own child. They forged my signature to take control of a trust fund meant for Brianna. They destroyed her credit by opening accounts in her name. They tried to erase her from existence, and now they have the audacity to sue her for money. Everything I have collected over 18 years is in that box. Emails where my daughter admitted they kicked Brianna out. The original trust documents the bank claimed were lost. Recorded voicemails, bank statements, hospital records showing Brianna was admitted for pneumonia at 18, severely underweight with no family contact listed, and credit card applications with my grandson's handwriting sent to my daughter's address. She looked back at my father, whose face had crumbled into something unrecognizable. I collected evidence for 18 years, she said, waiting for a day when the truth could finally come out. Today is that day. The judge called a 2-hour recess. In the hallway, I watched my father pace frantically, whispering harsh words at his lawyer. My mother sat on a bench with mascara streaking down her face, no longer bothering to perform for anyone. Ryan had disappeared entirely, probably trying to figure out how to run. I felt no joy, no triumph, just the quiet certainty of someone who had waited 18 years for this moment and finally had proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't worthless, wasn't the villain in my own story. When court resumed, the judge would deliver a verdict. But I already knew the most important thing: the lies were finally over. When court resumed, the lies were replaced by consequences. The judge returned to the bench with a thick folder and an expression that told me everything I needed to know before she said a single word. She had reviewed Eleanor's evidence during the recess. She had seen the forged signatures, the stolen money, the credit card applications in my brother's handwriting. And she was not pleased. The ruling was comprehensive and devastating. The filial support lawsuit filed by Gerald and Linda Blake was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed again. The evidence clearly established parental abandonment of a minor child, which under Pennsylvania law eliminated any obligation of financial support. Parents who throw their children away do not get to demand those children take care of them later. The law was clear, and my parents had no legal ground to stand on. But the judge was not finished. The counter lawsuit succeeded on multiple counts. Gerald and Linda Blake were found liable for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty regarding my grandfather's trust fund. They had forged documents to steal $50,000 from their own daughter, and the court would not let that stand. They were ordered to repay the original amount plus 18 years of interest and penalties, totaling $127,000. The identity theft evidence was forwarded to the district attorney's office with the judge's strong recommendation for criminal prosecution. She made it clear in her ruling that she believed crimes had been committed and that the perpetrators should face more than civil consequences. And in a rare move that made my father visibly flinch, the judge awarded me attorney's fees and sanctions against the Blakes for filing what she called a frivolous and vindictive lawsuit. Another $45,000 added to what they owed me. This court does not look kindly on parents who steal from their children, she said, and then have the audacity to demand that child support them. The total judgment against my family was over $170,000. They didn't have it. Their house would have to be sold. Their remaining assets would be seized. The life they had built on lies and stolen money was about to collapse completely, but the civil judgment was only the beginning. Catherine had coordinated with the district attorney's office before the trial even started. Based on the evidence we presented, particularly the credit card that had been opened just 14 months ago, arrest warrants had been prepared and sealed, waiting for the civil matter to conclude. The morning after the verdict, those warrants were executed. Police arrived at the Blake family home just after 7 in the morning. Ryan was arrested on 3 counts of identity theft, 1 count of credit card fraud, and 1 count of criminal use of a communication facility. Because his most recent offense was less than 2 years old, the statute of limitations was no obstacle. He was handcuffed in the driveway of the house, where I had once been thrown out with $20 and a suitcase someone else had packed. My father was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit identity theft. The evidence showed he had provided Ryan with my social security number and coached him on how to avoid detection. He had taught his son how to steal from his daughter, and now they would face justice together. My mother was named as a co-conspirator, but given her documented health issues, she was released on her own recognizance pending trial. She would face charges, but she would face them from home rather than a jail cell. I felt nothing about this distinction. Whether she waited in prison or in her living room, the outcome would be the same. The confrontation I had been expecting came in the courthouse parking lot after the civil verdict. My father cornered me near my car, his mask of composure completely gone. There was no more confident businessman, no more strategic thinker, just a desperate man watching everything he had built crumble around him. "You destroyed this family," he hissed at me. His voice was low and vicious, the voice I remembered from childhood when he was truly angry. "You've ruined us. Are you happy now?" I looked at him without flinching. I was not 17 anymore. I was not the scared girl he had thrown away. "No," I said calmly. "You destroyed this family 18 years ago, when you threw out your daughter for $50,000. I just made sure everyone finally knew what you did." Before he could respond, my mother appeared. She was crying, but these were different tears than the ones she had performed in the courtroom. These seemed real, pulled from somewhere genuine, though I no longer trusted myself to tell the difference with her. "Brianna, please," she said. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We can still be a family. I'm your mother, please." I looked at her for a long moment. I studied the face that had watched me leave with a packed suitcase and done nothing to stop it. The face that had told me I wasn't her problem anymore. The face that had lied to Eleanor for years, that had helped forge documents and steal money and destroy my credit without a moment of guilt. "You stopped being my mother the night you handed me $20 and told me I wasn't your problem," I said. "Everything since then has just been paperwork. I turned away from her and walked toward Eleanor, who had been watching quietly from a few feet away. "Let's go, Grandma," I said. "We have dinner reservations." I did not look back. 3 months later, the criminal cases concluded. Ryan pleaded guilty to avoid a trial he knew he would lose. He received 2 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Upon release, he would begin making restitution payments to me for the $80,000 he had stolen. It was a debt that would follow him for decades. The golden child who had never worked for anything would spend the rest of his adult life paying for what he took. My father faced conspiracy charges that could have brought 3 to 7 years in prison. Instead, he negotiated a plea deal: 18 months in county jail, 4 years of probation, and permanent surrender of any claim to contact me. He would serve his time in a minimum security facility, but for a man who had always prized his reputation and his control over others, the public humiliation was its own punishment. Everyone in our community now knew exactly what kind of person Gerald Blake really was. My mother's case was resolved with probation and community service due to her health conditions, but the judge issued a protective order preventing her from contacting me for 5 years. I suspected she would not try even after that time expired. The Blake family house was sold to pay legal fees and restitution. My parents moved to a small apartment across town, largely forgotten by neighbors, who now whispered different things about them. The family that had once made me feel worthless was now worth nothing at all. After the final sentencing hearing, Eleanor and I walked out of the courthouse together. The sun was warm on our faces, and for the first time in 18 years, there was nothing hanging over us. No secrets, no waiting, no fear of what they might do next. "You know what hurts the most," Eleanor said quietly as we reached the sidewalk. "It's not that they stole from you. It's that they stole 18 years from us. All the birthdays, all the holidays, all the time we could have had together." I took my grandmother's arm and held it gently. "They can't take anything else from us now," I said, "and we have plenty of time left." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "What do you want to do with it?" I thought about the girl who had slept in her car, who had eaten day-old bread, who had rebuilt her entire life from nothing because she refused to believe she was worthless. "I want to make sure no one else goes through what we did," I said. "I have some ideas." Those ideas became my purpose for the next year. 12 months after the final sentencing, I sat at my desk at North Star Advisory Group and looked around at everything I had built. The company had expanded not dramatically, but steadily, the same way I had always grown. We had more clients now, a bigger team, a reputation for integrity that money couldn't buy. A larger firm had approached me with a buyout offer that would have made me wealthy enough to never work again. I turned them down without hesitation. "I didn't build this to hand it to someone else," I told my team. This company was proof of what I could create when no one believed in me. I wasn't selling that for any price. But the business was only part of my life now. The better part was the time I spent with Eleanor. We made up for 18 lost years, the only way we could, by refusing to waste another day. I spent weekends with her, now real weekends, not rushed visits squeezed between obligations. We developed new traditions that belonged only to us. Sunday dinners became sacred. Monthly trips to the farmer's market became our ritual. We had long conversations about everything and nothing, the kind of talks I had always imagined having with a family that actually loved me. Eleanor moved into an assisted living community just 10 minutes from my home. It was a nice place, comfortable and safe, but that wasn't why she chose it. She chose it because she could see me whenever she wanted. After 18 years of searching, 18 years of waiting, 18 years of collecting evidence in the hope that someday the truth would matter, she finally had what she had prayed for. "This is what I wanted," she told me one evening as we sat together watching the sunset from her small balcony. "Not the trial, not the verdict, not watching them go to jail. Just this, being part of your life again." I held her hand and didn't say anything. Some moments don't need words. As for the people who had thrown me away, their lives unfolded exactly as you might expect. My father served his 18 months in county jail and emerged a diminished man. No one would hire him. No one trusted him. The business contacts who had once respected him now crossed the street to avoid conversation. He found part-time work at a hardware store, lived in a small apartment, and sent monthly restitution checks that would continue for years. For a man who had always measured his worth by his control over others, this quiet irrelevance was its own kind of prison. My mother's health stabilized, but her social world collapsed completely. The church friends who had brought casseroles and sympathy disappeared once they learned the truth. The neighborhood acquaintances who had believed her stories about the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family now whispered different things when she walked by. She spent most days alone in the small apartment she shared with my father, watching television and waiting for phone calls that never came. Ryan finished his 2 years in state prison and was released to begin his probation. He moved to another state, started over in construction work, and began the long process of paying back the $80,000 he had stolen from me. I heard through Eleanor that he was trying to rebuild a life, though I suspected he had never actually built one in the first place. The golden child who had been given everything had never learned how to earn anything. None of them contacted me. Not a letter, not a phone call, not even a message through a lawyer. I hadn't forbidden it. They simply understood finally that they had nothing left to take from me, and that was the only kind of relationship they had ever known how to have. My real family now looked very different from the one I had been born into. There was Eleanor, of course, the grandmother who had never stopped fighting for me, even when fighting meant waiting in silence. There was Marcus Webb, my first mentor, now a close friend who joined us for Sunday dinners and argued with Eleanor about politics, in a way that made her laugh. There was a small circle of colleagues and friends who had chosen to be in my life and whom I had chosen in return. Not many people, but the right ones, and there were the young people I had decided to help. The scholarship fund was my idea that had become something real. It was designed for young people aging out of foster care or escaping difficult family situations, kids who had been thrown away like I had been thrown away and who needed someone to believe in them. The first group of recipients gathered in my office for an orientation meeting, nervous and uncertain, looking at me like I might be another adult who would let them down. I told them the truth. Family isn't blood, I said. Family is the people who stay when you have nothing to offer them. Everyone else is just relatives you share DNA with. I told them my story not for sympathy, but so they would understand that I knew what it felt like to have no one. And I told them they weren't alone anymore. A journalist writing about the scholarship fund asked me the question that everyone eventually asks. Did you ever forgive them? I considered my answer carefully. Forgiveness is a complicated word, I said. If you mean, do I wish them well? Not particularly. If you mean, have I stopped being angry? Mostly yes. If you mean, would I let them back into my life? Absolutely not. I paused. I think what people really want to know is whether I'm at peace. And the answer is yes. Not because they apologized. They never really did. Not because they were punished, although that helped. But because I built a life that has nothing to do with them. They wanted me to disappear. I didn't. That's its own kind of answer. Last Sunday, I drove to Eleanor's place for dinner. My route took me past the shopping center where I had once parked my car overnight, hiding from security guards rationing day-old bread from the bakery. The bakery was gone now, replaced by a fancy coffee shop with expensive drinks and comfortable chairs. I could afford anything on their menu without thinking about it. But I kept driving. There was nothing there for me anymore. Just geography. At Eleanor's apartment, dinner was waiting. Marcus had brought his famous apple pie. The scholarship committee wanted to discuss next year's recipients. There was work to do, life to live, people to love. I had spent 18 years waiting for justice. When it finally came, I discovered something unexpected. It wasn't the verdict that mattered most. It was everything I had built while waiting. The career, the relationships, the person I had become. My family had thrown me away like garbage. I turned myself into gold. Not to prove anything to them, but to prove something to myself. I had always been worth more than what they were willing to give me. Some families are bound by blood. The best families are bound by choice. I chose my grandmother, my mentor, and the young people I now had the privilege to help. I didn't need anyone else. I never had. Brianna's story teaches us something that many of us learn too late in life. The people who share your blood are not always the people who deserve your loyalty. Family is not defined by genetics. It is defined by actions, by presence, by the choice to stay when staying is hard. If you are in a situation where the people who should love you are instead using you, their treatment of you says everything about who they are and nothing about what you are worth. You do not owe your peace to anyone who has stolen it from you. You do not owe forgiveness to anyone who has never truly asked for it. And you certainly do not owe your future to anyone who tried to destroy your past. But here's the most important lesson from Brianna's 18-year journey. Justice does not always come quickly. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes decades. But if you live with integrity, if you document everything, if you build your life brick by brick without compromising who you are, justice will come. Not always as revenge, but as truth finally spoken in a place where no one can silence it. The best revenge is not destruction. The best revenge is becoming someone they cannot touch, building something they cannot take, and living proof that their cruelty did not define you. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to redefine what family means to you? Have you ever waited years for justice and finally received it? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about resilience, justice, and the quiet power of refusing to give up, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Thank you for listening. Until next time.